The Alliance Military Station's mess hall serves thousands of personnel from multiple species, human, Thessari, and various other Alliance members rotating through assignments requiring temporary station presence during post-war recovery operations. The mess hall operates continuously across 3 shifts accommodating different duty schedules. During peak hours, it's crowded and loud, hundreds of people eating meals, conducting informal meetings, engaging in the social interactions that military life depends on when formal duty hours conclude. Technician David Chen works maintenance shifts on the station, repair and upkeep of systems requiring constant attention to keep massive military facility operational. His duty schedule puts his meal times during evening hours when the mess hall is busiest. He's been assigned to the station for 4 months, long enough to recognize regular patterns in how people use the mess hall, who sits with whom, which tables are preferred by different groups. One pattern is absolute and unvarying. No one sits near Commander Seraphina. Commander Seraphina is the Thessari warrior with reputation that precedes her everywhere she goes. Battle-scarred, visible marks from numerous combat engagements covering her armor and occasionally visible on exposed skin when she's in station casual wear rather than full military gear. Her combat record is extraordinary. 15 years of frontline service, decorated multiple times for tactical excellence and for personal valor under fire, credited with victories in engagements where success seemed impossible based on tactical assessments. But her reputation isn't just about combat effectiveness. It's about unpredictability and intensity that makes people uncomfortable. Stories circulate about her training methods, pushing personnel beyond normal limits, accepting no excuses for failure, maintaining standards that many consider unreasonably harsh. About her responses to disrespect or incompetence, swift, severe, memorable in ways that make people avoid crossing her. About incidents during combat where her tactical decisions were brilliant but brutal, achieving objectives while accepting casualties that other commanders would have considered unacceptable, prioritizing mission success over protecting personnel in ways that saved strategic situations while traumatizing those who survived the operations. The stories paint her as untouchable, someone you respect from distance, someone you don't approach casually, someone whose effectiveness is unquestionable but whose company is something to avoid rather than seeking out. Battle-scarred, unpredictable, untouchable. No one dares sit near her in the mess hall, not explicitly prohibited. There's no formal rule keeping people away, just understood pattern that everyone follows. When Commander Seraphina enters the mess hall, people make space. Conversations lower, chairs shift, trays get quietly relocated to tables that provide comfortable distance from wherever she chooses to sit. She always sits alone, at table near the mess hall's rear wall, position that provides clear sightlines to the entrance and that minimizes approach angles, tactical positioning even in the dining facility. The seat directly across from her remains empty every night. The adjacent seats stay vacant. She eats in isolation maintained by collective decision that approaching her isn't worth whatever discomfort or risk that proximity might create. David has watched this pattern for 4 months, noticed how absolute it is, how even senior officers who outrank Commander Seraphina give her space rather than sitting nearby, how the isolation is maintained not through her actively driving people away, but through everyone independently choosing to maintain distance. Tonight follows the same pattern. The mess hall is loud during evening meal hour. Hundreds of conversations creating ambient noise that makes the space feel vibrant and social. People clustered at tables throughout the facility, informal groups forming and reforming as people finish meals and depart while others arrive. Then Commander Seraphina walks in. The noise doesn't stop entirely. That would be too obvious, but it lowers perceptibly. Conversations continue at reduced volume. People glance toward the entrance, register her presence, make subtle adjustments to their positioning. She moves through the serving line with practiced efficiency, selects her meal without engaging in the casual exchange that many people conduct with mess hall staff, carries her tray toward her usual table in the rear. The space around that table clears as people finish meals slightly earlier than they would have otherwise, as newcomers choosing seating select tables that provide comfortable distance from where Commander Seraphina is settling. Within 2 minutes of her arrival, she sits alone, the seat across from her empty, the adjacent positions vacant, 10-foot radius of isolation maintained through collective avoidance. David watches this unfold while finishing his own meal at table across the mess hall. He's watched it happen dozens of times over 4 months. The pattern is so consistent it's become unremarkable, just how the mess hall functions when Commander Seraphina is present. But tonight something bothers him about the isolation more than usual. Maybe it's because he's been on the station long enough to feel established rather than still adjusting to new assignment. Maybe it's because he's had particularly good shift today and feels more confident than usual. Maybe it's just accumulated observation of the pattern creating discomfort that finally demands response. He finishes his meal, stands with his tray, could dispose of it and leave the mess hall, returning to his quarters or to other post-shift activities. Instead, he walks toward Commander Seraphina's table. No dramatic speech. No challenge to the pattern everyone else maintains. Just simple decision to approach rather than avoiding. The room doesn't go completely quiet. People aren't watching him specifically, aren't aware yet that he's breaking the absolute pattern of isolation around the notorious warrior. He reaches her table, stops at the empty seat directly across from her. "This seat taken?" he asks simply. Commander Seraphina looks up from her meal. Her expression shows surprise, genuine surprise rather than offense or warning. As if someone approaching to sit with her is so unexpected that processing the situation requires a moment of adjustment. "No," she says after brief pause. "Seat's empty." David sets his tray down and sits. That's when the room goes quiet. Not completely silent. That would be too dramatic, too obvious. But conversations near their table die. People at adjacent tables lower their voices. Attention shifts subtly toward where human technician just violated 4 months of absolute pattern by sitting across from the warrior everyone else avoids. Because approaching her wasn't brave in the sense of facing down threat or standing up to intimidation. It was reckless in the sense of ignoring warnings that everyone else takes seriously, of treating situation that demands caution as if it's casual and unremarkable. At least, that's what everyone watching believes. David doesn't make speech about why he sat down, doesn't explain his reasoning or justify his choice. Just begins eating his meal as if sitting across from Commander Seraphina is perfectly normal, rather than pattern-breaking behavior that the entire mess hall is processing. The silence stretches between them. Not hostile silence, just absence of conversation between two people who don't know each other beyond reputation and observation. As that silence extends, David realizes something the others apparently haven't considered despite months of maintaining distance. Legends are loud. Everyone knows Commander Seraphina's reputation. Stories about her tactical brilliance and her harsh training methods and her brutal effectiveness circulate constantly. Her legend fills the space around her even when she's silent. But loneliness isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention the way reputation does. Sitting across from her in the quiet isolation that everyone else maintains, David sees what the legend obscures. Not the notorious warrior who makes people uncomfortable through intensity and unpredictability. Just someone eating alone every night because reputation creates distance. No one crosses despite that distance being chosen isolation, rather than her actively driving people away. Commander Seraphina doesn't speak immediately. She continues eating her meal with the same focused efficiency she brought to selecting it, not engaging socially, just completing necessary function. David does the same. Not forcing conversation, not explaining why he sat down, just eating his own meal while sharing the table. The mess hall's atmosphere remains altered. Conversations near their table stay quieter than usual. People eating nearby finish their meals and leave without lingering. New arrivals selecting seats choose tables farther away, creating expanding bubble of space around where David and Seraphina sit. After several minutes of silence, Seraphina speaks. "You're either remarkably brave or remarkably stupid. I haven't determined which." "Probably the second one," David responds easily. "Brave suggests I assessed risks and chose to face them. Stupid suggests I didn't think about it very carefully before deciding to sit down. That's more accurate description." "You didn't think about sitting with me?" Seraphina asks with slight skepticism. "Everyone else thinks about it very carefully and decides not to. You're claiming you made opposite choice without consideration." "I thought about it," David clarifies, "but not in terms of assessing risks or calculating whether approaching you was safe. I thought, that seat's been empty for 4 months and maybe someone should sit there, and then I came over and sat down." That's less brave assessment of danger than just not giving the danger enough consideration to let it stop me. "Most people give the danger considerable consideration," Seraphina observes. "They assess correctly that sitting near me creates discomfort they'd prefer to avoid. You either didn't do that assessment or you did it and reached different conclusion than everyone else. Which was it?" "I notice people avoid sitting near you," David says. "Watched the pattern for 4 months, saw how consistent it is. But I never understood what specific danger everyone's avoiding." "You've never actually done anything to people in the mess hall. You just eat your meals and leave. The avoidance seems based on reputation rather than on actual threat you represent in dining facility." "Reputation is accurate assessment of who I am," Seraphina responds. "The stories about harsh training methods and brutal tactical decisions, those aren't exaggerations. I am demanding commander who accepts no excuses and who prioritizes mission success over comfortable methods. People who have served under me know that firsthand. Others know it through stories that accurately reflect my approach. The avoidance isn't baseless fear. It's rational response to my actual nature." "Maybe," David acknowledges. "But sitting across from you while you eat dinner doesn't require serving under your command or experiencing your tactical decisions. It just requires sharing table for 20 minutes. The danger everyone's avoiding in that specific context isn't the harsh commander who demands excellence. It's just the discomfort of being near someone with intimidating reputation. I figured I could handle 20 minutes of discomfort if it meant the empty seat got used." Seraphina regards him with expression mixing assessment and something that might be amusement. "You sat down to use empty seat. That's your motivation. Efficiency about furniture utilization." "That's partial motivation," David admits. "Also, I've watched you sit alone for 4 months, and it seemed like pattern worth breaking, even if breaking it creates awkwardness. The legend about the notorious warrior is very loud, but the isolation that legend creates, that's quieter, doesn't announce itself, but it's present every night in the empty seats around you. Figured maybe someone should acknowledge the isolation by actually sitting down, rather than contributing to it by staying away. You're sitting with me out of sympathy for my loneliness." Seraphina summarizes with tone suggesting she's uncertain whether to be offended or touched by this motivation. "I'm sitting here because the seat was empty and I decided to use it," David corrects. "Whether that decision reflects sympathy or just different assessment of risk versus everyone else, I'm not entirely sure, but here I am. Seats being used, patterns broken, and you haven't actually done anything to make me regret the choice, which suggests maybe the danger everyone avoids isn't as present as reputation indicates." "I haven't done anything yet," Seraphina points out. "Meal's not finished. Plenty of time for me to demonstrate why people maintain distance." "True," David agrees, "but I suspect you're not going to. Because despite the reputation for being harsh and unpredictable, You seem perfectly capable of having quiet meal with unexpected company, without turning it into demonstration of why the isolation is justified. The legendary warrior might be intimidating. The person eating dinner is just someone who's surprised someone sat down and who's processing how to respond to that unexpected situation. Seraphina is silent for a moment, then asks, "What's your name? And what's your assignment on this station? I know you're human technician based on uniform insignia, but beyond that I don't recognize you from any duty interactions." David Chen, he provides, maintenance technician assigned to environmental systems. I keep air circulating and temperature regulated and water flowing. Not glamorous work, but necessary for keeping station operational. Been here 4 months. Never interacted with you professionally because command-level officers don't generally need to coordinate with maintenance technicians about environmental system repairs. 4 months, Seraphina notes. So you've watched the mess hall isolation pattern for your entire assignment, saw it consistently, and decided tonight to break it. What changed? Why tonight rather than any of previous nights over 4 months? Nothing specific changed, David says. Just accumulated observation reaching point, where doing something about it felt more right than continuing to observe without acting. Pattern that's wrong doesn't become more acceptable through repetition. It becomes more clearly wrong as you watch it continue. Tonight, I decided I'd watched long enough. You think the isolation pattern is wrong, Seraphina observes. Most people think it's appropriate response to my reputation. That maintaining distance from demanding commander during off-duty hours is reasonable boundary that protects their peace rather than wrong pattern requiring correction. Maybe it's appropriate for them, David acknowledges. I'm not judging other people's choices about where to sit, but it seemed wrong that the pattern was so absolute. That literally no one ever sat with you despite mess hall being social space, where isolation should be choice, rather than inevitable result of reputation. Breaking absolute pattern even if other people's distance remains appropriate for them. That felt like correction worth making. So you appointed yourself pattern breaker, Seraphina says. Decided unilaterally that my isolation required someone to address it by sitting down uninvited. Pretty much, David confirms. If that's offensive rather than welcome, I apologize. But I'm not moving to different table unless you explicitly ask me to leave. Because walking away after sitting down would reinforce the pattern rather than breaking it. I'll finish my meal here unless you'd prefer I didn't. Seraphina considers, then responds. Stay. Finish your meal. I'm processing having company after 4 months of isolation, but processing doesn't require you to leave. The surprise is manageable. They return to eating in silence. But it's different silence now. Acknowledged shared space rather than isolation interrupted by unexpected presence. As they finish their meals, other mess hall occupants continue processing the broken pattern. Captain Marcus Webb, senior human officer on the station, approaches their table with careful diplomatic bearing. Technician Chen, Commander Seraphina, I hope I'm not interrupting. What do you need, Captain? Seraphina asks neutrally. Just checking on unusual situation, Webb says carefully. Technician Chen, I'm not ordering you away from this table, but I want to confirm this is your choice rather than situation where you're uncomfortable but unsure how to extract yourself. It's my choice, David confirms. I sat down deliberately. I'm staying deliberately. No extraction needed. Commander Seraphina, I want to confirm Technician Chen's presence is acceptable to you and isn't creating situation requiring command intervention, Webb continues. His presence is unexpected but acceptable, Seraphina responds. No intervention required. He sat down. I'm allowing him to remain. That's extent of situation requiring command attention. Understood, Webb acknowledges. Carry on. After Webb departs, David observes. He was worried about me. Thought maybe I didn't know what I was doing by sitting with you, and that I might need rescuing from situation I'd gotten myself into through ignorance. He was worried about both of us, Seraphina corrects. Worried about you potentially not understanding dynamics. Also worried about me potentially reacting poorly to uninvited company and creating incident requiring damage control. His concern was diplomatic rather than just protective. Does my presence create incident requiring damage control? David asks. Not so far, Seraphina says, though the evening's still young. Plenty of time for this to develop into regrettable situation. You keep suggesting you might do something that makes me regret sitting here, David notes. But you haven't actually indicated what that something might be or why it would occur. The warnings seem more automatic than based on actual intention to create problems. The warnings are based on accurate self-knowledge that I'm a difficult person who makes others uncomfortable, Seraphina explains. I don't intend to create problems, but my nature tends to generate them regardless of intention. People who spend time near me eventually experience why the distance exists. I'm warning you about that reality, rather than suggesting I plan specific problematic actions. What aspect of your nature makes people uncomfortable in context of sharing dinner table? David asks directly. Seraphina considers, then provides honest answer. I don't engage in casual social pleasantries effectively. I don't make small talk. I don't perform the friendly accessibility that makes people comfortable. Even when I'm not being harsh commander demanding excellence, I'm still intense person who doesn't know how to be easy company. That intensity makes extended proximity uncomfortable even when I'm not actively being difficult. I'm maintenance technician who spends most of my duty hours alone with environmental systems, David responds. I'm not especially skilled at casual social pleasantries either. The standard mess hall social dynamics, friendly banter, easy conversation, comfortable group interactions. I participate adequately, but I don't find them particularly natural. Sitting here in quiet with someone who doesn't perform social accessibility. That's actually more comfortable for me than trying to maintain pleasant conversation at more social table. You're saying my lack of social grace is feature rather than flaw from your perspective, Seraphina observes. I'm saying the intensity everyone finds uncomfortable. I find it less uncomfortable than performing social ease I don't naturally possess, David clarifies. The isolation everyone maintains around you creates quiet space. I appreciate quiet space more than I appreciate loud social dynamics that mess hall usually features. So sitting here serves my preferences, even while breaking pattern everyone else maintains. You didn't sit down out of sympathy for my loneliness, Seraphina realizes. You sat down because you wanted quiet table and recognized that sitting with me would guarantee that. Both can be true, David says. I noticed the isolation seemed wrong. I also recognized sitting here would be quieter than sitting at more social table. Multiple motivations can coexist. The pattern breaking and the preference for quiet aren't contradictory reasons. They finish their meals. The standard next step would be disposing of trays and departing mess hall for other post-shift activities. David stands with his tray. Could simply leave, having broken the pattern for one night but not establishing any ongoing expectation. Same time tomorrow, he asks instead. Seraphina shows surprise again. Apparently she expected him to treat this as one-time occurrence rather than beginning of pattern. You want to sit here again tomorrow? Tonight wasn't sufficient pattern breaking. Tonight broke the absolute isolation, David says. But one night doesn't establish that the seat's actually available rather than just temporarily occupied through unusual circumstances. Sitting here regularly, that establishes the seat isn't permanently empty due to your reputation. That it's just seat that happens to be available if someone wants to use it. You're proposing to become regular dinner companion, Seraphina summarizes. Not just breaking pattern once but establishing different pattern where someone sits with me consistently. If that's acceptable to you, David confirms. If you'd prefer tonight remains isolated incident rather than beginning of ongoing arrangement, I respect that preference. But if you're amenable to company during evening meals, I'm offering to provide it. Seraphina considers longer than the simple question seems to warrant, processing implications of accepting regular company after years of maintained isolation. Same time tomorrow, she agrees finally. We'll see if one night of tolerating each other extends to sustainable pattern, or if familiarity reveals why the isolation existed in the first place. Over following weeks, David sits with Commander Seraphina during evening meals regularly. The mess hall gradually adjusts to the new pattern. Initially, people watch with continued surprise that the human technician maintains his position at her table. Then the surprise fades into acceptance. That's just where David eats dinner now. Across from Commander Seraphina at the table, everyone else still avoids. Some people interpret David's choice as remarkable courage, continuing to sit with Notorious warrior despite her reputation. Others interpret it as remarkable obliviousness, somehow not understanding the dynamics that everyone else takes seriously. David doesn't particularly care how people interpret it. He sits there because the arrangement works for both him and Seraphina. Quiet table, no pressure for social performance, companionable silence that's more comfortable than isolation for her, and more comfortable than forced socialization for him. The conversations that do develop are sparse but substantial, not small talk about weather or casual station gossip. When they talk, it's about topics with actual weight, tactical philosophy, engineering challenges, perspectives on leadership, observations about alliance culture. Seraphina gradually reveals aspects of herself beyond the harsh commander reputation. Her tactical brilliance comes with awareness of costs that her decisions impose. Her demanding training methods reflect genuine commitment to preparing people for combat realities rather than just enjoying being harsh. The intensity that makes people uncomfortable, it comes from caring deeply about excellence and about survival rather than from personality flaw or deliberate intimidation. David shares his own perspective, preference for solitary technical work over social dynamics, appreciation for competence over popularity, recognition that intensity can be a valuable trait even when it makes others uncomfortable. 3 months after David first sat down at her table, Dr. Thessari, Thessari physician who's observed their developing pattern, approaches Seraphina privately. Commander, I've noticed Technician Chen has become regular presence at your dinner table. That's unusual development given your previous isolation. I'm curious whether the arrangement is beneficial or whether it's obligation you've accepted out of politeness despite preferring solitude. It's beneficial, Seraphina confirms. I didn't realize how much the isolation was affecting me until Chen broke it. The loneliness wasn't loud. I wasn't consciously aware I was suffering from maintained distance. But having regular company during evening meals, it's revealed that the isolation was more costly than I recognized. Chen's presence is appreciated rather than just tolerated. He approached you initially without invitation, Thessari notes. Just sat down at your table despite everyone else maintaining distance. That's remarkable initiative given your reputation. He saw what others didn't, Seraphina responds. That the legend about the notorious warrior creates loud presence, but that loneliness underneath the legend is quiet, doesn't announce itself. He recognized the isolation needed addressing even though it wasn't obviously present. Then he addressed it through simple action rather than making dramatic gesture about it. That combination, seeing what's quiet and acting without performance, that's why the pattern works where other approaches wouldn't have. 6 months after initially sitting down, David and Seraphina's evening meal arrangement has become established fixture in mess hall social dynamics. People no longer find it surprising. New arrivals to the station learn quickly that Technician Chen sits with Commander Seraphina during evening meals, and that this is normal pattern rather than unusual occurrence requiring comment. The isolation around Seraphina has lessened slightly, not eliminated. People still maintain distance, but the absolute avoidance has softened to cautious respect rather than fearful distance. During one evening meal, Lieutenant Vethros, young Thessari officer who serves under Seraphina's command, approaches their table hesitantly. "Commander, may I join you?" he asks formally. Seraphina shows surprise. In 6 months since David began sitting with her, no one else has requested to join the table. "You're asking to sit here voluntarily, not under orders or obligation." "Voluntarily," Vethros confirms. "I've observed Technician Chen's pattern for months. Notice that sitting with you hasn't resulted in any of the negative outcomes people warn about. It occurred to me that maybe the reputation creates more distance than your actual nature requires. I'd like to test that hypothesis, if you're willing to permit it." "Sit," Seraphina allows, gesturing to one of the other empty seats. Vethros sits carefully, clearly uncertain about how to behave. The conversation is awkward initially. He's too aware of her reputation and her rank to be comfortable, trying to navigate between appropriate military respect and the casual social dynamic that dinner companions should maintain. But he stays for the entire meal, returns the next evening, gradually relaxes into the pattern that David established: quiet table where intense warrior can exist without performing social accessibility, but also without experiencing complete isolation. Over following months, others occasionally join. Not regularly. The table never becomes crowded social gathering, but the absolute isolation that existed before David sat down doesn't return. 2 people becomes 3, occasionally 4. The empty seats around Commander Seraphina are sometimes filled instead of always vacant. One evening, Seraphina comments to David, "You changed mess hall dynamics by sitting down 6 months ago. The pattern you broke, its absence created space for others to reconsider their distance. Lieutenant Vethros sits here now because you demonstrated it was possible. Others occasionally join because your presence normalized approaching me. You didn't just break pattern for yourself. You broke it in ways that allowed others to reconsider their automatic avoidance." "I just wanted to use empty seat," David responds with slight smile. "The larger social dynamics were unintended consequences." "Unintended but significant," Seraphina says. "The legend about the notorious warrior was loud, filled the space around me even when I was silent. The loneliness underneath was quiet. I wasn't even fully aware of how isolated I'd become until you addressed it by simply sitting down. Your small act of normalcy, treating me as person worth sitting with rather than as legend to avoid, that broke through wall built by fear that I'd contributed to, but didn't know how to dismantle. The wall was built by reputation that people took too seriously," David observes. "You're demanding commander. That's accurate reputation. But demanding commander during duty hours doesn't mean unapproachable legend during off-duty meals." The fear that maintained the isolation was based on not distinguishing between contexts. Breaking that pattern just required someone willing to make the distinction, to recognize that sitting across from you during dinner doesn't require experiencing your harsh training methods or brutal tactical decisions. "You saw what others missed," Seraphina says. "That legends are loud but loneliness isn't. That the space I occupied in mess hall was filled with reputation that obscured the isolation underneath. You addressed the quiet problem rather than being distracted by the loud reputation. That's gift I didn't know I needed until you provided it." "I sat down an empty seat," David says simply. "Everything else developed from that small choice. I'm glad it worked out to be beneficial rather than just awkward mistake. But the significance you're assigning to it, that's more than I consciously intended when I walked over here 6 months ago with my dinner tray." "Small acts of normalcy can have large consequences," Seraphina responds. especially when they address problems that aren't loudly visible but that quietly damage people over time. You broke isolation I'd accepted as inevitable result of my reputation. Showed me and showed others that the distance was choice rather than requirement. That's not small accomplishment, even if motivation was simple as wanting to use empty seat. After the meal, as they're disposing of their trays, David asks, "Do you still find my presence unexpected after 6 months? Or has having dinner companion become normal part of your routine?" "It's become normal," Seraphina confirms. "Normal enough that I'd notice the absence now if you stopped sitting there. The isolation I accepted for years, I couldn't go back to that easily now that I've experienced the alternative. You've created dependency on company I didn't know I needed. That's both gift and vulnerability you've given me through that first choice to sit down at empty seat." "Company shouldn't be dependency," David says. "It should be mutual choice that both people maintain because it's beneficial. If I ever don't sit with you, it won't be abandonment. It'll be schedule conflict or other circumstance. The pattern we've established is sustainable rather than fragile, because it's based on genuine compatibility, rather than on one person rescuing the other from isolation." "Still," Seraphina says, "thank you for sitting down that first night. For seeing the quiet isolation underneath the loud reputation. For choosing to address it through simple action rather than ignoring it like everyone else. The small act of normalcy, treating me as person worth sitting with, that broke through wall I didn't know how to dismantle myself. Sometimes that's exactly what's needed. Someone willing to take empty seat and make it occupied despite warnings that approaching is reckless rather than brave." The mess hall was loud until she walked in. No one dared sit near her. The seat across from her remained empty every night, until I carried my tray over and sat down. No dramatic speech, no challenge, just a simple decision. The room went quiet.